Right. Good morning again. And today's class is once again the first segment of the epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot will be discussed. And I'd like to read the text in slight detail with you so that you get a sense of what Pope is trying to do. In my earlier discussion, I had mentioned that the epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot is part of a series of Horatian epistles that Pope wrote, which talked about poetry, which talked about taste, which talked about human nature. And the epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot was written on the eve of Arbuthnot's death, when Pope realized that his friend was suffering from a terminal illness. And a lot of autobiographical elements go into the epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot. And my argument in this entire series is that Pope is creating a version, deliberately creating a version of his poetic self, which he wants to foreground to his readers. And therefore, the epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, of all of his satires, is in effect a poetic justification of his method and motivation, as it were, of writing satire. That is my fundamental argument. The secondary argument is that, of course, that Pope is creating a series of satiric portraits, some of his friends, but mostly of his rivals both in politics and poetry, and also in terms of the patronage. And the third argument is that Pope's Arbuthnot is a critique of the contemporary poetic universe, as it were, and the systems that held this poetic universe together, the coexistence of high culture and Grub Street, the predominance of a exploding print culture, and also the system of patronage and the kind of poetic rivalries that existed between the people of the period. So these are the three arguments that I am fundamentally going to bring to this discussion. And I will straight away launch into the projection of the text. I have already sent to you this version. So you have it already. You can open this in your sort of servers also, but I will project so that you can take a look at this. Before I begin, here is something which Pope writes, and I'm reading this from the from this text, the poems of Alexander Pope, which I have as a hard copy. I can't circulate that as a soft copy, but maybe I'll circulate a picture of this to you. This particular page. Pope writes that, this paper is a sort of a bill of a complaint. And he says that it was drawn up by snatches. So bill of complaint, I would say, is more of a poetic justification, as I just added. And he says he is responding to some persons of rank and fortune who attacked in a very extraordinary manner, not only my writings, but my person, morals, and family. So in a certain way, the epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot is also a riposte, or a kind of a reply to Lord Hervey and Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, who had attacked Pope's family, Pope's writings, and Pope's parentage. Right. So these are issues that will crop up in the course of the poem. And he says, being divided between the necessity to say something of myself, I thought it the shortest way to put the last hand to this epistle. And that is why I'm arguing that it is very much, Arbuthnot is a portrait, a self-portrait of Pope, as it were. So a projection of his poetic self. And he says, well, I make not the free use of theirs as they have done of mine. And he says, any abuse may be directed at any man, no injury can possibly be done by mine, since a nameless character can never be found out but by its truth and likeness. So Arbuthnot's role here is that of a moderator who advises Pope that he should not take names and be blatantly satiric, but he should, conceal his satire between the garb of generality. Right. So that is what Arbuthnot will do. And Arbuthnot appears in this poem periodically to remind Pope of the spirit of moderation in satire. Right. So this is the epistle. And I'll be dividing the epistle into several sections. Every sort of class will be directed towards one particular section. And in this particular section, what we will look at is how Pope creates himself as a preeminent poet, almost like Horace in the literary scenario of England. So in a certain sense, this is a projection, a self-projection by Pope as being recognized as the center of literature or center of high literature in England. So he becomes the dominant poet to whom everybody is looking at, right, either favorably or unfavorably, for patronage or for recommendations. Pope is establishing himself, trying to create a selfhood that is the preeminent poet of England. And therefore, this is his sort of preface from Tully, in fact, Marcus Tully. And it says, I won't read the Latin, but you can take a look at the annotations here. The annotations are given here. You will not any longer attend to the vulgar mob's gossip. So Pope, by invoking Tully, is separating his poetry from the vulgar mob's gossip. So it's the center of high culture, not of Grub Street. And put your trust in human rewards for your deeds. Virtue, through her own charms, should lead you to true glory. So Pope is also isolating himself. He's not part of the rabble of poets. He's an isolated figure who's speaking truth. So Pope's self-image is that of the preeminent poet like Horace, who stands as a champion for truth and virtue. Let what others say about you be their concern. Whatever it is, they will say it anyways. Right. So this is from the Publica. This is Tully or Cicero, whose lines Pope takes as a kind of a preface. Right. Okay. I see the advertisement is there. And then you see how Pope begins this very dramatically. Shut the door, good John. John is John Searle, his butler, as it were, his servant. So people are, as it were, crowding to Pope's door, knocking on his door always. And therefore, very dramatic opening where Pope's house is, as it were, besieged by budding poets. Fatigued, I said, tie up the knocker. In contemporary England, the knocker was the kind of a common calling bell, and people who were tired or who were sort of diseased used to tie up their knocker. Say, I'm sick, I'm dead. The dog star rages. The dog star would be the time in Rome when poets usually would read their poetry. So this is poetic season, as it were. Nate is past a doubt, all bedlam or Parnassus is let out. So, the sort of bringing together of bedlam, which is madness, and Parnassus, which is the seat of poetry and truth, is, as it were, everybody, all poets of all hues, people who are, mad, people who are poetically inclined, have all come out to read their poetry, and they've all come to Pope, right? Fire in each eye and papers in each hand, they rave, recite, and madden around the land. What walls can guard me? What shades can hide? So he's sort of besieged in his grotto, as it were. Pope had this grotto or a cave, and you will remember that Pope was a Catholic, Roman Catholic, who lived away from London. He had to reside in the other part across the Thames. And this was his, Twickenham was his residence. And he built his own cave in in Twickenham, the grotto he called it, where he often retired to write poetry. So what walls can guard me, what shades can hide? They pierce my thickets, so they come through my garden, through my grot they glide. And you notice once again this dramatic convergence of people on Pope's house, this creation of this image that he's besieged by poets, by land, by water. So across the Thames, they renew the charge, they stop the chariot and they board the barge with which he crossed the river from Twickenham to the court. No place is sacred, not the church is free, even Sunday shines no Sabbath to me. Then from the Mint is the place where, one could not be arrested, right? So people who were debt-ridden would often go and hide in the Mint so that they could not be captured. Walks forth the man of rhyme, happy to catch me just at dinner time, right? So, it's almost a bedlam-like situation where everybody started writing poetry. And this very well refers to the contemporary vogue of printing, because print became cheap, because there was a lot of circulation, so everybody tried their hand at poetry. Pope is also referring, as I have often told you during our undergraduate days, to Grub Street, which was the center of this print culture near Moorfields on the suburbs of London. And, it is true that 18th century London saw a glut of writing, not only of poetry, but also of various prose forms, diaries, autobiographies, biographies, religious writings, pamphlets, and of course, also poetry. So Pope says, I am besieged because I am the preeminent poet. Everybody is coming to me. So is there a person much bemused in beer, a maudling poetess, a rhyming peer? So people from all classes, somebody who's a drunk, somebody who's a woman, somebody who's a peer, who's a nobleman, clerk, foredoomed his father's soul to cross, who paints a stanza when he should engross, when who should study, he's writing his poetry. Is there who locked from ink and paper scrawls with desperate charcoal round his darkened walls, even prisoners, all fly to Twickenham, right? And in humble strain apply to me to give them mad or vain, to keep them mad or vain. Arthur, whose giddy son neglects the laws, imputes to me and my damned works the cause. Poor Cornus here is a kind of a sort of cuckold who's being betrayed by his wife. Poor Cornus sees his frantic wife elope and curses wit and poetry and Pope, right? So he curses wit and poetry and Pope, but Arthur here refers to, and you can see there's a lot of contemporary allusions, is Arthur Moore, a politician, and his son, actually, James Moore, had given offense by refusing to remove some of Pope's unpublished verses from his comedy. So he had plagiarized Pope's poems, his son, and therefore Arthur, whose giddy son neglects the laws, imputes to me and my damned works the cause. So contemporary allusions that all around people are flocking to his house from all classes, and everybody is out to steal from his poems. Friend to my life, this is the reference to Dr. Arbuthnot. I pointed out that Dr. Arbuthnot was one of the most important Catholic scientific presences of the period, physician to Queen Anne at one point of time, and Pope's very long friend from the Scribler's Club. So friend to my life, which did not you prolong? So you had helped me, you prolong my life. Please also remember that Pope was a very sick man in the sense that he was diseased. He had a hunchback, he was afflicted by polio, and therefore Pope refers to this long disease, my life, right? So, which did you not prolong? So Arbuthnot had been a constant companion and physician to Pope. The world had wanted many an idle song. So had you not prolonged my life, I would not have been able to sing. What drop or nostrum can this plague remove? He says, what medicine can you give to remove this plague of poetry? Right? So it's a different disease of everybody, all Tom, Dick, and Harry trying to write. Or which must end me a fool's wrath or love? A dire dilemma, either way am I sped. If foes they write, if friends they read me dead. Right? So either people criticize me or they want to read to me. Seized and tied down to judge how wretched I, who can't be silent, who will not lie. So another thing that comes out is that Pope will give his honest opinion, right? That he will not praise or criticize personally, right? So he is the true critic who will offer his rational opinion. See how he's building his personality up. The poetic persona that he seeks to project is not only one of preeminence, but also of rational and critical insight. I sit with sad civility, I read, with honest anguish and aching head, and drop at last, but in unwilling years, this saving counsel, keep your peace 9 years. Now, I reminded you that this is keep your peace 9 years, is taken from Horace's Ars Poetica, and that is the advice that Horace also gives to poets, that one must continuously revise one's poetry so that it is kept for 9 years before publication. So Pope is generally asking his friends and enemies who supply him with documents and poetic efforts to revise their poetry. 9 years, cries he who high in Drury Lane, lulled by soft zephyrs. Drury Lane is once again the seedy area where you had prostitutes, theatre houses. So people who are frequenting these places, lulled by soft zephyrs through the broken pane, rhymes ere he wakes and prints before the term ends. Term here is the printing season, obliged by hunger and request of friends. So he's referring to the hack writers who are visiting Grub Street and Drury Lane, who reside with prostitutes and who write for money. You'll remember we talked at length about these hack writers while we were discussing Mac Flecknoe. This piece you think is incorrect. Why take it? I'm all submission. What you would have it, make it. So people not only ask for him to read the poems, they also ask him to correct their poetry. Three things, another's modest wishes bound, my friendship and a prologue and £10. Right? So, you see, this is very interesting. The Pope says that Pope's friendship is at a premium to poets. His prologue, right? So when Pope writes a prologue, it is as it were a distinguished writer or a distinguished poet is introducing, therefore the saleability increases, and £10 is the subscription. So the reference to this culture of subscription, as I said, the two things which Pope will attack in Arbuthnot. One is this system of subscription where you actually subscribe before printing, and from the subscription, the printing cost would come up, you'd be sent a book. And secondly is this process of patronage, where, writing was a profession which did not pay, therefore you had to have a patron who paid you. And this obviously led to a lot of, coteries. It led to inferior poets being sort of patronized and superior poets sort of rejected. Pithelin sends to me, you know his grace. I want a patron. Ask him for a place. Pithelin is a foolish poet at Rhodes who pretended much to Greek. Now, this is taken from Horace, and this would refer to Leonard Welsted, Welsted, who had a terrible sort of quarrel with Pope, but later apologized to him, right? So even his enemies want his recommendation. You know his grace. a patron. I want a patron, ask him for a place. Titulian libelled me, but here's a letter. This is the letter of apology. Informs you, sir, 'twas when he knew no better. Dare you refuse him? Curl invites to dine. Curl, Edmund Curl, was a CD publisher who often, published Pope's poetry without permission. So Pope is not only sort of the toast of all poets, but even publishers illegitimately publish him. Curl, if he invites to dine, he will write journal or he will turn divine. So, either he will criticize me or he will praise me, but everybody is after Pope. Bless me a packet. So he's been sent a packet by a stranger, a packet of poems. A stranger choose a virgin tragedy or an orphan muse. If I dislike it, so if I criticize it, they abuse me, furies, death, and rage. If I approve, commend it to the stage. So this is a play which is written, and therefore they seek Pope's recommendation. There, thank my stars, my whole commission ends. The players, the theatre, and I are luckily no friends. Fired that the house rejects him, his death I'll print it, and shame the fools, your interest, sir, with lintet. Right, so if it is unpopular on stage, they want to print the play, and they ask for Pope's favor in communicating with Lintet. Lintet was his publisher. Right, so Pope is besieged from all fronts that either he has to read their poetry or recommend it to the stage, or correct it, or recommend it to the publisher. See, what's being done here is how Pope becomes the epicenter, as it were, as projecting himself as the epicenter of high poetry and high culture in 18th century England. Lintet, dull rogue, will think your price too much. Not, sir, if you revise it and retouch. Right, so, he's asking him, Pope, to revise his poetry. All my demurs and double his attacks. At last he whispers, do, and we'll go snacks. We'll share the profits. Glad of a quarrel, straight I clap the door. Sir, let me see your works, and you no more. 'Tis sung when Midas's years began to spring. You will remember the classical allusion when Midas praised Pan rather than Apollo, and Apollo gave him ass's ears. The story is told, of course, in Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. Midas, a sacred person and a king, his very minister who spied them first, some say his queen. Now, this particular allusion is important because this reference to Midas and his queen, Midas with his ass's ears and his queen, has a slight reference to Walpole, Robert Walpole, the Prime Minister of England, who was very close to Queen Anne, right? And therefore, there's this, sense of collusion between Walpole and the Queen. Was forced to speak or burst, and 'tis not mine, my friend, a sorer case, when every coxcomb perks them in my face, right? Now, very interestingly, immediately, for the first time now, when he's referred to the Queen and he's referred to Midas, is referred to Walpole, immediately, Arbuthnot intervenes. This is the first time that we actually have Arbuthnot's intervention. Good friend, for beer, you deal in dangerous things. I'd never name queens, ministers, or kings. Keep close to ears and let those asses prick. It's nothing if they bite and kick. So there's a dialogue which Pope and Arbuthnot are having now, and Pope is suggesting that, satire, he can't let everything lie, and he will respond, right? Out with it, Dunshiard. So immediately Pope says, what I'll do is I'll write virulent satire. Dunshiard is obviously his reference to the 1726 poem, where he criticized almost every single poetic and aristocratic rival. Out with it, Dunshiard, let the secret pass. That secret to each fool, that he is an ass. The truth once told, and wherefore should we lie? The queen of Midas slept, and so may I. So when I know that this person is a fool, how do I respond? I write a satire. But Arbuthnot is urging him not to be direct, not to name people, but to be oblique in his satire. You think this cruel? Take this for a rule. No creature smarts so little as a fool. Right. Let pearls of laughter chorus around thee break. Now, this reference to chorus is the name of a poet who was ridiculed by Virgil and Juvenal. Right. So let peals of laughter. So who is a fool does not understand that he's a fool. So he's very insensitive. Thou unconcerned canst hear the mighty crack. Pit, box, and gallery. So this is the reference to the various audiences in the theatre. In convulsions hurled, thou standest unshook amidst a bursting world. Who shames a scribbler? Break one cobweb through. He spins the slight self-pleasing thread anew. So this is a reference to the slight thread, is the reference to the cobweb or the spider. Now, in my last discussion too, I had referred to this entire metaphor that that Dryden, Pope, and Swift used of the spider and the bee. The bee was one who produced less copiously, who produced little but produced honey, who produced something of substance, of quality. So this is the true poet, versus the false poet, who is very prolific, like the spider, continuously weaves, but only weaves cobwebs. Right. So Pope is talking about this entire cobweb of or web of poetry in 18th century England, which was which drew sustenance upon this cheap print culture, but which was of very dubious quality. He spins the slight self-pleasing thread anew. Destroy his fib or sophistry. Sophistry is argument. In vain, the creature's at his dirty work again. So this is a reference, to the popular culture and what we know as Grub Street, where, the inferior poets keep on producing one poetry or one play after the other. The creature's at his dirty work again, throned in the center of his thin design. So he's carrying on this metaphor of the spider, proud of a vast extent of flimsy lines, flimsy as in without merit, thin. Whom have I hurt? Once again, he refers to, you see how self-reflexive the poem is. It's continuously coming back to his own image. It's as it were he's indulging in a narcissistic exploration of his poetic life. Whom have I hurt? The poet has poet yet or peer lost the arched eyebrow or the Parnassian sneer, and has not Cully still his lord and whore? So there are a cluster of references here which you can check out from the annotations. Cully would once again would refer to Colley Cibber, whom he had criticized in the Dunciad. His butcher's Henley, his freeman's Moore. So he's referring to Henley, his rival poet. Does not one table Bavius still admit? Bavius is a classical reference to an inferior poet, once again, of the Roman age. Still to one Bishop Phelps sing a wit. Still Sappho. And Sappho is Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, right? And immediately, once again, you see, whenever Pope is in danger of referring to a contemporary noble personality, Arbuthnot intervenes. Hold, nay, see you, ill offend. No names, be calm, learn prudence of a friend. So Arbuthnot is a figure of prudence in this text. Somebody who advises Pope not to go overboard with his satire, not to be very direct. So in a certain sense, there is a duo or a duality within the personality. What is the good satirist likely to be? The good satirist, like Pope, is going to be frank, he's going to be critical, he's going to appreciate or criticize justly, but also Arbuthnot suggests that a good satirist will be oblique rather than direct, will not be vicious, and will not take or satirize directly, right? So in a certain sense, together Arbuthnot and Pope create the composite personality of the ideal satirist, right? And this is the Horatian satirist, therefore the Horatian's epistle. So Arbuthnot is checking Pope whenever he's sort of almost on the verge of naming names. No names, be calm, learn prudence of a friend. So satire, venom, and prudence come together in the personality that Pope is seeking to project. I too could write, and Arbuthnot says, and I'm twice as tall. This is a reference to Pope's height. Pope, please remember, was a very short, only 4 feet tall person with a hunchback. I too could write, and I am twice as tall, but foes like this, one flatterer's worse than all. So till now, Pope had been talking about poor poets who were his enemies, who were not inclined positively to him. Now, Pope is going to talk about his friends who are poor poets, so his flatterers. So not only is Pope from danger from his enemies or rival poets who libel him and criticize him, but Pope is also in danger from people who flatter. So now the poem sort of suggests that if enmity or spite is something that the poet has to fight against, he equally should be vigilant against flattery. One flatterer's worse than all. Of all mad creatures, if the learned are right, it is the slaver kills and not the bite. So, it is the abject flattery that kills, that destroys, rather than the bite. A fool quite angry is quite innocent. Alas, 'tis time 10 times worse when they repent. So now what do the flatterers do? One dedicates in high heroic prose and ridicules beyond 100 foes. So the praise from somebody who's an inferior poet is 10 times as bad. One from Grub Street will my frame defend. So Pope is suggesting that he does not need his flatterers from Grub Street, and more abusive calls himself my friends. This prints my letter that expects a bribe, and others roar aloud, subscribe, subscribe. So this culture of subscription and this representation of the contemporary 18th century print sphere, which is based on subscription and therefore flattery, patronage, is something that calls or comes under Pope's critical scanner. Right. So there are some to whom my person pay their coat. I cuff like Horace. So people praise me in extraordinary terms. But you see, what again is how Pope's poems, create his personality almost like a Horatian figure who is at the center of poetic discourse. I cuff like Horace, and though lean am short. Ammon's great son, one shoulder had too high. This is the reference to Alexander. So Pope, as it were, is as tall poetically as Horace and as tall in terms of bravery as Alexander. Such Ovid's nose. So, and sir, you have an eye, go on, obliging creatures, and make me see all that disgraced my betters met in me. Right. So Pope is talking about how he's sort of projected as, a combination of Alexander and Horace and Ovid. Say for my comfort, languishing in bed, just so immortal marrow held his head. And when I die, be sure you let me know, great Homer died 3,000 years ago. Right. So once again, this reference, of course, is to Alexander. The reference is to the Pope. I'm sorry, to Ovid. The reference is to great Homer. So therefore, Pope is suggesting that these high-flown flattery is as dangerous as the attacks on his personality. Right. So I'll stop here for the moment, but let me come back to the first section. This is the first section, actually. So what has Pope done? Pope has very dramatically started this epistle. As I said, that it has three purposes. One is to establish his primacy as a poet in 18th century England, one. To give us a contemporary picture of 18th century print sphere with its system of patronage, with its system of subscriptions, and let me just charge. And with its system of patronage and its rampant, explosive generation of print. And the third thing that he has done is that he's established himself as a figure not only of preeminence, but also of critical insight and honest virtue and integrity, right? He's drawn this picture of contemporary England as being sort of bitten by the itch to write, to create poetry or literature. And he's sort of seen this Twickenham grotto as the place where all poets flock to gain his recommendations or subscriptions. And he's seen the 18th century poetic world as a world where, which is dominated by inferior poets, flatterers, and one which is continuously, marked by tremendous friction and tremendous inner hostilities. So the poetomachia, this kind of rivalry between the poets, this personal attack, is something that is part and parcel of this print culture. And this is where Arbuthnot becomes important. As a figure who advocates moderation, as a figure who advocates prudence, and who suggests that true satire should not, lampoon or, hurt personalities, but should rather criticize general vices of humanity. So it is in this, kind of composite existence of Arbuthnot and Pope together, taken together, the poet with integrity but venom, and the man of moderation who urges prudence, and the criticism of vices rather than personalities, that Pope creates the ideal satiric persona of the poet. At the same time, this is a poem of great, sort of personal projection, in the sense that Pope very deliberately wants himself to be recognized through his own writings as the epicenter of poetry in 18th century England. Right. So this is the first segment where his position in the literary scenario is highlighted. In the next scenario, we'll take a look at why Pope writes, what his background is, and who are his detractors. And this is going to be very important, right? How Pope will talk about his progress in poetry, and he will also talk about his detractors. So we'll take up the next section in our next discussion, as it were, which should be tomorrow. And in the meanwhile, I will invite your responses or your questions, if any, at this point, as I sort of stop the recording